Here we go. Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1. The commodity. All right, let's see if we can do it correct this time. And again, sorry for everybody who was tuning in and then not hearing anything and then leaving. My bad here. I'm gonna have to figure out how to like stream it on Twitter and Twitch and things like that later. But here we go. All right, Chapter 1, the commodity. The two factors of the commodity: use value and value. Substance of value, magnitude of value. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Okay. So let's break this down into its steps. So first we have the wealth of societies. What does wealth mean for Marx? For Marx, wealth means the amount of use values. So think about somebody who has a lot of nice stuff, right? They've got a nice car, they've got nice clothes, a nice watch, and all of these things, but they don't have any money, right? They've spent it all on this nice stuff. There's a way in which you can say that they're wealthy, but it's not necessarily insofar as they have money. It's because they have a lot of things, right? They have a lot of use values. So wealth, the what Marx calls the material content of wealth, is the amount of use values. So the wealth of society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. Okay, so what's a mode of production? A mode of production, simply put, is the means of production and the relations of production. What are the means of production? They're your technology, your industry, your tools, your science, everything that lets you do things productively and efficiently. And then your relations of production, the division of labor, like how you actually divide up that labor amongst people in society. Capitalist, when it's dominated by the profit motive, by private capital, by the mode of production being organized around producing private profits, prevails, herrscht, meaning, from like, think about Herr, like, which is like sir or Mr. in German, to dominate, to lead, to be the chief, right? The dominant mode of production. So we're talking about societies where the capitalist mode of production is dominant, but this use of the word dominant means that it's the primary mode of production, but not necessarily the only mode of production. Pure capitalism, where it's the only mode of production, doesn't exist. And that means, implicitly, like, you can have a capitalist mode of production as the dominant mode of production. You'd still have remnants of earlier modes of production. People can still do artisan work, make their commodities directly and sell them on a market. People can still do, there can be still remnants of feudal relations under capital, with the capitalist mode of production being the dominant mode. Similarly, the socialist mode of production could be the dominant mode, and there could be subordinate modes of production to this socialist mode of production, right? Like remaining capitalist modes of production with underneath a dominant socialist mode. Appears as a immense collection of commodities. A commodity, that's what we're going to find out what that is. We're going to figure out what that is in this chapter, but a commodity, simply put, is something that's bought or sold. And so Marx is saying that the wealth of societies, the amount of use values, useful things, the stuff we've got, how much we got, appears as an immense collection of commodities whenever it's the capitalist mode of production. This word appearance is very important. The German word is erscheint, from the verb erscheinen, and appearance in the sense, the noun form would be erscheinung. So German has different words for appearance. It has Schein, which means appearance in the sense of semblance, illusion, what seems to be the case. But then there's Erscheinung, or Erscheinen, which means that it's the way that some real thing appears. It's like the form that it makes its appearance. And Marx is quite careful to use Hegelian categories in their specific Hegelian ways. From Hegel's perspective, it's important to recognize that things, in order for us to interact with them, have to have a form of appearance, have to make themselves visible in some way. Hegel says in response to the people who claim that knowledge only has to deal with appearances, he says, damn right, and if things didn't appear to us, we couldn't find food, we would die of hunger. So you can think about food as like, if you have a lot of food, you're like really wealthy. Food has to take on a form of appearance for us to be able to find it. And the form of appearance that food takes under capitalism is the commodity form. It appears as something that can be bought or sold. You have to go, to find food, you have to go buy commodities. And so appearance here doesn't mean an illusion. It's not like the wealth is like really just wealth, but then there's an illusion that it's all commodities. They really do. Wealth really does take on this form under the capitalist mode of production of appearing as a commodity. Now, this appearance can create all sorts of problems. Something that one of the major problems that Marx identifies with a lot of the bourgeois economic thinking is that it sees only the appearance, but doesn't see the underlying reality. So we can understand some things, like the bourgeois political economist, he thinks, can understand some things about society at the level of appearances, but they don't go beneath them to the level of reality. And so think about something like this. You have the wealth of society, and it appears as an immense collection of commodities. So consider the 15.5 million vacant homes in the United States. Those appear as commodities. They appear as things that can be bought or sold. They don't appear as use values. So we have all these homes, and then we have all these homeless people, 650,000 homeless people. But because they have this form of appearance, and that's the only thing we see of these things as commodities, things to be bought and sold, we can't utilize this wealth in the same way, as efficiently as it might be to say, like, we'll just give these homes so that these people have houses. Because everything under capitalism appears in the commodity form, appears as something to be bought or sold, and that's how we access wealth, is through the commodity form. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. So as a dialectical investigation, he's beginning with the cell, as we talked about, of capitalism. The cell of capitalism is the commodity form. It's the most basic element. The commodity is, first of all, an external object. It's something outside of us in the real world. Now, you might say, what about like something like intellectual property? Well, it would seem to think that there has to be some like externalization of it, that it's like it can be copied digitally or something like this. But there is some kind of expression, like if I'm going to give my idea to you, I have to communicate to you in an external form to some degree. It's a thing which through its quality satisfies human needs of whatever kind. Now, this is a mistranslation. This is actually the word Eigenschaften in German, which is properties. And there's a distinction in Hegelian logic between properties and qualities. Qualities stand in a dialectical or negative relationship to other qualities. For example, red. Red stands in opposition to yellow, to green, to blue, to these other things. And so that's that quality. Quality in Hegelian terms is a determination of being. Being meaning, you say this is red, it's not yellow or blue or green or whatever. Property for Hegel is a determination of essence. It's about what things are, and it's about the kinds of relationships they stand into other things and what manifests about a thing. And so as property, Hegel would say it's reflected back into the thing. And the dialectical point of tension in properties is not how it stands in relationship quality to other qualities, but its tension with the thing itself. So if the thing is red, like Etch-a-Sketch here is red, but it's also square, right? It has different properties. Those are all proper to the thing, but the thing is a unity of multiplicity of properties. So property has to do with the tension between the thing and its many properties, whereas quality is it's this thing and not that other thing. It's red and it's not yellow. And Marx is careful to use the terms in this way, yet it's not reflected in the translation here. Okay, so the commodity is, first of all, an external object. It exists somewhere in the world. A thing which, through its properties, satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise from the, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Desire implies want. It is the appetite of the mind, and as natural as hunger to the body. The greatest number of things have their value from supplying the wants of the mind. Nicholas Barbin. That's the quote here. So this is important. A commodity is not just something that satisfies what we objectively need. It satisfies whatever we subjectively want as well, whatever we imagine or think we need. So the need supplied by a commodity can arise from the stomach just as well as from, a physical, actual need. Nor does it matter here how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of subsistence, i.e. an object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production. So things can be, directly consumed by us, or we can produce commodities and sell them, and that they can then get bought to be used to make more commodities, right? Machines are commodities too. Okay. Every useful thing, for example, iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from 2 points of view, quality and quantity. So useful thing, nützliche Ding, is not a commodity necessarily, right? Things could be useful things without being commodities, but it's something that has a use value. Every useful thing is a whole composed of many properties. So here we go again, talking again about properties as opposed to qualities. So things are a whole, but this whole is the unity of a multiplicity of many properties. And because it has many properties, it can have many uses. It can be used in various ways, depending on these many properties. The discovery of these ways, and hence of the manifold uses of things, is the work of history. Things have an intrinsic virtue. This is Barbin's special term for use value, which in all places have the same virtue, the lodestone to attract iron. The magnet's property of attracting iron only became useful once it had led to the discovery of magnetic polarity. So, historically, new uses for things are discovered. New useful properties of things are discovered. So also is the invention of socially recognized standards of measurement for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of the measures for commodities arises in part from the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, and in part from convention. Right? So a barrel of wine, that's a commodity-specific unit of measurement. And it has something to do with wine, right? Because you have to put wine in a barrel. A bottle, too, right? Could be a measure in that way. But where we draw the distinction between different sizes and things like this can be conventional, too. But there are these standards of measurements. So we have the qualities of the use values, which is like what they can do, what needs can they satisfy. And then we have the quantity, how much of it. And these have differences depending on what type of thing it is. The usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. So now we have this term use value introduced. But this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity and has no existence apart from the latter. Use value is materially conditioned. Things can only have usefulness if they have the real material properties to do whatever it is we want them to do. And so there's a material, physical aspect to use value. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself, for iron, for instance, iron, corn, a diamond, which is the use value or useful thing. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. Okay, so first, it's the physical thing, the body of the commodity. That's the use value, the real physical substance. This property, however, of being useful, of having useful material properties, has nothing to do with the amount of labor required to make it. But an amount of labor is required to make it in most cases, right? Unless it's a naturally occurring thing. When examining use values, we must always assume we are dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. Okay, so there's always a specific amount of that useful thing. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of commodities. Right? Okay, so there's apparently some special branch of knowledge about stuff. I'm sure there exist such things today. Use values are only realized, verwerklicht, in use or consumption. This is important. So, right, like you're walking in the woods and you find like, you know, there used to be a railroad track here that's not in use anymore, and it's all like falling apart and broken. That's not a use value because the train can't run on those tracks anymore. And so for something to be use value, it has to be consumable. It has to be capable of being realized in consumption. They constitute the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be. So wealth, the material content of wealth, is use value. But this material content, the amount of use values, these things, can take on different social forms depending on what society we're talking about. In the form of society to be considered here, there are also the material bearers, Träger, of exchange value. As Träger, from tragen, to carry, to wear, to bear. Marx uses this to talk about the roles that people play in the preface, but also here he talks about commodities, as it were, are playing a role. We'll see. He'll kind of do like the commodities will speak at some point in this chapter, as we'll see. So now we have the second big concept, exchange value. So wealth as a material content. Yet this wealth appears different ways depending on the society. Yet wealth as a material content is something objective and does not, this objectivity of this material content does not change regardless of the social form. The use values of commodities is not dependent on, it's not a social construct. Okay, so now let's go to exchange value. Exchange value appears first of all as the quantitative relation, the proportion, in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. So I have 1,000 pencils, and I want to trade those for 2 boots. That's where exchange value appears, is in an act of trading one thing for another. It's quantitative because there are 2 boots and 1,000 pencils. There's a proportion because I'm saying 2 boots is proportional to 1,000 pencils. And then there's one type of use value, boots. I can put them on my feet. And another kind of use values, pencils. Draw stuff with them. And I'm trading them for each other. Exchanging one for another. Exchange value appears in this relationship. Now, Marx, let's talk about how a dialectical analysis works. Marx is going to start with the basic building blocks of exchange, of value, and then build up on these. It's going to feel like a historical analysis that's based on the evolution of things. And in fact, it may mirror how these things came about in society themselves. But Marx is not giving a historical genesis here. He's giving a logical account of the logical genesis of things, where we begin with the smallest, most abstract, most simple concepts and build up layers until we have the more complicated system. So we're going to start by talking about bartering. What happens when I trade one thing for another? Now, when we introduce money, things are going to be more complicated, right? And we're going to go to even more complicated stages when we introduce things like wages, price, supply, demand, like all of those things. And those might actually sublate some of the earlier stages. Yet these earlier stages inform the logic of what's going on at the later stages. And so this is how that dialectical method works. We start with the most simple, the most abstract, and we slowly build our way up to the top. Okay, so exchange value, trading things. This relation changes constantly with time and place. The relationship that is between, 2 boots might be worth 1,000 pencils, and then later they might be worth 900 pencils. Or, it depends on where you're going, what kind of pencils they got, and all these things, right? Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an extrinsic value, that is an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity inherent in it, seems a contradiction in terms. Now, this word appearance is very important here, because here the word is not appearance as erscheint, it's shine, meaning seems to be, meaning an illusionary appearance. So he's saying, because things change in their value at different times and in different places, it seems what things are worth is made up. It seems purely relative. So it doesn't seem like things have an intrinsic value, one that's connected to the commodity itself, but it just seems that things have value in relation to other things. Although, as we'll see, things are not always what they appear. Let's consider the matter more closely. So he's saying that's how it seems, but what's really going on? A given commodity, a quarter of wheat, for example, is exchanged for X boot polish, Y silk, or Z gold, etc. In short, it is exchanged for other commodities in the most diverse proportions. All right, so our example was 1,000 pencils for 2 boots. Well, we could also trade the 2 boots for a leather bag, maybe, right? So that'd be 1 leather bag is 2 boots. And that's a different proportion. That's a 2 to 1 as opposed to a 2 to 1,000. Therefore, the wheat has many exchange values instead of 1. Or in our case, the 2 boots, or the bag has the exchange value of 2 boots, or it has the exchange value of 1,000 pencils, right? These are different exchange values because of the different things we could trade them for. But X boot polish, Y silk, Z gold are each represent the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat. So it's transitive, right? Or I guess not transitive here, but it's reverse too, right? If 2 boots are worth 1,000 pencils, then 1,000 pencils are also worth 2 boots, right? And then if 2 boots are worth a bag, then a bag is also worth 2 boots. Therefore, X boot polish, Y silk, Z gold, etc. must, as exchange values, be mutually replaceable or of identical magnitude. There must be either the same, or we can just replace them all with each other, something along these lines. It follows from this, firstly, that the valid exchange values of a particular commodity express something equal, and secondly, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the form of appearance of a content distinguishable from it. So, first, valid exchange values, so valid here meaning that you're not cheating, of a particular commodity express something equal. So, for an exchange to be fair, something equal must be expressed in the 2 boots and in the 1,000 pencils. Secondly, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the form of appearance of a content distinguishable from it. Since we can trade out what these 2 boots are worth, then those things that it can be traded for are those exchange values, right? These 2 boots have the value of being exchangeable for all of these different things. All of those different things are just the form of appearance of some content that boot has that is expressed in those different things. Let us now take 2 commodities, for example, corn and iron. Whatever their exchange relation may be, It can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For instance, 1/4 of corn equals 1, let's say, pound, I don't know what this measurement is, of iron. What does this equation signify? All right, so 1/4 of corn is X pounds of iron. It signifies that a common element of identical magnitude exists in two different things, 1/4 of corn, similarly in X pounds of iron. Both are therefore equal to a third thing, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, insofar as it is an exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third thing. Okay. So if 2 boots is worth 1,000 pencils, and 1,000 pencils is worth 2 boots, by saying they're equal, we're saying that there's something equal in the two of them, some magnitude. That's this third thing that we're trying to figure out, that the exchange value represents. A simple geometrical example will illustrate this. In order to determine and compare the areas of all rectilinear figures, we split them up into triangles, and the triangle itself is reduced to an expression totally different from its visible shape, half the product of the base and the altitude. In the same way, exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element, in which they represent a greater or lesser quality. So I'm going to try to figure out this triangle example this time. See if I can do it. Okay. So I think what Marx is saying is, like, if you want to measure this figure, then one way to do that would be to, like, cut this here. Measure these triangles. Something like this. They're all square, though, guys. I guess you do the square, right? But if this were, like, I don't know, some weirder figure where there's, like, I don't know, like some like bullshit like this going on, right? Then I can, like, draw a triangle here, here, and all this stuff, right? Something like that, I think, is what he's saying. Right? And so, but even when I'm measuring this triangle, I'm, like, cutting it, I'm treating it like a square here and then, like, dividing it in half. So I'm not even treating it like what it is. And so he's saying that there's something similar going on with commodities, just as this shape is expressed by dividing it up into a bunch of different triangles and then measuring it in terms of the triangles, that the commodities measure each other in a similar way. And, you know, that's my best stab at this example. I'm a geometer. Sorry, Plato. But, you know, if there's any, you know, one wants to add to that in the comments, please let me know. But I think that's pretty much what's going on there. Okay. So in the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element, which they represent a greater or lesser quality. This common element cannot be geometrical, physical, chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. So the element that makes these things equal is not a material property. It's not a physical property that can be located scientifically in the commodities. Such properties come into consideration only to the extent that they make the commodities useful, that is, turn them into use values. So, right, use values depends on the material, physical things. But clearly the exchange relation of commodities is characterized precisely by its abstraction from their use values. So when we exchange things from each other, we're looking at them in terms of this magnitude, and these things can be replaced with each other. And so exchanging abstracts from the uses of these things. We're looking at, you know, we're talking about, oh, what are these 2 boots? These 2 boots are 1,000 pencils and a bag. So we're abstracting from the uses of these things and using them just as measurements, basically. Within the exchange relation, one use value is worth just as much as another, provided only that it is present in the appropriate quantity. Whereas old Barban says one sort of wares are just as good as another if the value it be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is as great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver and gold, right? So there's the old, like, you know, riddle, like, what weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of lead? Well, they both weigh a pound, right? And so what this would show is that weight as an abstraction, as a measure, is abstracts from what particular type of thing is being weighed. They're all equal weight, regardless of whether they're feathers or lead, because they have the same magnitude. Similarly, $100 worth of feathers or $100 worth of iron are both $100. And so the price here abstracts from whatever particular type of thing it's a price of in a similar way. And so it abstracts from the use values because it abstracts from all the material properties. As use values, commodities differ above all in quality, right? You know, like this Bic pencil differs in quality from this nicer one, right? That's made of like metal as opposed to plastic. This screwdriver is fundamentally different from this pencil. They have completely different uses, so they're qualitatively different. While as exchange values, they can differ only in quantity, and therefore do not contain an atom of use value, right? So things can only be more or less valuable than each other. They can't be, there's not a qualitative difference in how much something's worth, right? Like this can't be $100 and then a qualitatively more money, right? It's only more money as a number, right? If we then disregard the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor, right? And we saw that already. And Marx said the use value of the commodity and its material property is independent to how long it takes to make that thing. They have nothing to do with each other. So if we abstract from all use values, as we're doing in the exchange relation, then all that remains is that these things are made by people doing labor. If we make abstraction from its use value, we also abstract from the material constituents and forms which make it a use value, right? So we're not taking use value into consideration. The matter and shape of the thing doesn't matter either. It is no longer a table, a house, a piece of yarn, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous characteristics are extinguished. So there's nothing sensuous about this thing. It's just valuable. Nor is it any longer the product of a labor of the joiner, the mason, or the spinner of any particular type of productive labor. If we're abstracting from what type of use value it is, we're also abstracting from what type of labor went into it, even though some labor definitely did go into it. With the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. So as use values, they are products of human labor, although being products of human labor is not a feature of their being use values. But it is a fact about these commodities that they were produced by specific types of labor. But as far as they are on a market, insofar as they're on a market and just have a price, and what type of thing doesn't matter, just how much it's worth. Similarly, everything on the market is a product of human labor in some way. Yet it doesn't matter what kind of human labor. It's human labor in the abstract. So this is another example of real abstraction within Marx. First, we saw it where the exchange value abstracts everything from everything useful about the commodity, and now it turns the concrete labor, the specific actual labor that's done in the commodity, into labor in the abstract. It was just done by some kind of labor, abstract labor. This is something that the actual social activity of exchanging things performs an operation that seems conceptual, but it's a real abstraction. It's the activity itself is abstracting from the labor. Now let us look at the residue of the products of labor. There is nothing left of them, in each case, but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e. of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. So just somebody did some labor. It doesn't matter what kind. It's here in this commodity. And it's here in this expressed in this exchange value. All these things tell us is that some human labor has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values, commodity values. So the new term Marx is introducing now, value. We have seen that when commodities are in the relation of exchange, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. Right? How much something's worth has nothing to do with what it's useful for. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value, as has just been defined. The common factor in the exchange relation, or in the exchange value of the commodity, is therefore its value. So right back here, remember, he said there has to be a content distinguishable from what's being traded. There has to be, each of them has to be reducible to a third thing. When they're equated with each other, what's equated is that third thing. What's that third thing now? It's what Marx is now calling value. The progress of investigation will lead us back to exchange value as the necessary mode of expression or form of appearance of value. For the present, however, we must consider the nature of value independently of its form of appearance, its Erscheinungsform. So what we're going to have is a situation, remember, appearance is always like things to show themselves have to make an appearance. Value is the substance that is expressed in exchange value. When I take the two boots and I trade them and I say these are equal to 1,000 pencils, the 1,000 pencils is the form of appearance of that value takes. But it's not the value itself. The value is the real thing that's expressed in terms of 1,000 pencils or a bag, right? So value, mode of expression. A use value or useful article, therefore, has value only because abstract human labor is objectified or materialized in it. Vergegenständlich. This is like to make an object. So Gegenstand is object. So vergegenständlich is to like objectify. A use value or a useful article, therefore, has value only because abstract human labor, so not particular human labor, but some kind of human labor whatsoever, is objectified or materialized in it. This is a product of human labor, some kind of human labor. How then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? So if that's what value is that it's human labor in this, that's why it has value. How can you measure the magnitude of human labor? By means of the quantity of the value-forming substance, the labor contained in the article. How much labor was put into this thing? This quantity is measured by its duration. So how long did you work? And the labor time itself is measured on the particular scale of hours, days, etc. So when trading things with each other, let's back up. What does it mean? What is exploitation? This is something I talk to my students about. If you're in a study group and there are 3 people in a study group and 2 people do all the work and 1 person does none of the work, that person hasn't done their fair share and is exploiting the other people. Similarly, if I'm the pencil maker and, let's say I'm doing this by hand, right? And it takes me an hour to make a pencil, or maybe like I make 4 pencils an hour, doing it with like a pocket knife and like lead and stuff like that, right? Well, in this example, where we don't have a low, non-industrial society, well, I'm making pencils all day. Somebody else is making a boot. It might take them 8 hours to make a boot, where I make 4 pencils in an hour. If I then say, like, Here's a pencil. Give me the boot you spent all day making, right? That's not a fair trade. Because I can make these pencils and make 4 pencils in an hour, right? It takes me 15 minutes to make a pencil. But it takes the boot maker 8 hours to make a boot. It's not a fair trade, right? Because somebody put in more work than another person. What markets are is a way that labor is metabolized, meaning forms, like one form of labor is traded for another form of labor. And when people are getting unfair deals, it's because there's an unevenness to the labor that's been put into things. What determines a value from a Marxist economic standpoint is how long did it take you to make something? How much labor time has been put into it? Well, and then we got a problem, a question that arises that Marx responds to. It might seem that the value of the commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended to produce it. It would be the more valuable, the more unskillful and lazy the worker who produced it, because he would need more time to complete the article, right? Okay, well, I'm just going to take all day to do things, so I get paid more. That's not how it works. However, the labor that forms the substance of value is equal to human labor, the expenditure of identical human labor power. The total labor power of society, which is manifested in the values of the world of commodities, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, although composed of innumerable individual units of labor power. Each of these units is the same as any other to the extent that it has the character of a socially average unit of labor power and acts as such, i.e. only needs, in order to produce a commodity, the labor time, which is necessary on average, or in other words, is socially necessary. So if we just abstract and talk about the total labor power of society, we can look at that as a bunch of different units. And each of those units, when we just kind of think about them from the standpoint of the whole, does something on average. It takes those units an average amount of time to do things. And so something in there is socially necessary, right? So if it takes me all day to make this pencil, right? Using a pocket knife or something, that's not going to make this more valuable because I spent so much time to do it, because it's no longer socially necessary for us to spend that much time making pencils, because we have technology that pencil fucking factories, right? Socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society, right? So if I make this pencil from scratch on my own, I'm not using the normal production conditions for pencils in my society, and I don't have the average degree of skill and intensity required, or the machinery required to do it in the way that my society does it socially. And so then it follows from this that the introduction of power looms into England, for example, probably reduced one half the labor required to convert a given quality of yarn into woven fabric. In order to do this, the English hand loom weaver, in fact, needed the same amount of labor time as before, but the product of this individual hour of labor now only represented half an hour of social labor, and consequently fell to one half its former value. Okay, so I have a power loom, and I can make 8 pieces of yarn in 8 hours, and now my power loom is more efficient, and I can make 16 in 8 hours. Each piece of yarn now is worth half the value that it was before, because now I'm making 2 per hour instead of 1 per hour, and so that 1 hour of labor is spread over 2 things instead of 1 thing, so it's cut in half. What exclusively determines the magnitude of value of any article is therefore the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for production. So any article, amount of socially necessary labor. The individual commodity counts here only as an average sample of its kind. Commodities which contain equal quantities of labor, which can be produced within the same time, have therefore the same value, right? So if it takes me the same amount of time to make boots as it does to make a bag, or 2 boots as it does to make a bag, they have the same value. The value of a commodity is related to the value of any other commodity, as the labor time necessary for the production of the one is related to the labor time necessary for the production of the other. All right. So, how much time does it take me to make this? How much time does it take me to make that? That's how their values relate to each other. As exchange values, all commodities are merely definite quantities of congealed labor time, right? So 1,000 pencils can be made using the same amount of labor time as 2 boots, allegedly, right? That's the example. And so the labor time that's been congealed into those 1,000 pencils is the same amount as those 2 boots in this example. And so that's the definite quantity. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant, right? So if there was no changes in efficiency or technology, value would stay the same. But the latter changes with every variation in the productivity of labor. So if labor gets more or less productive, value changes. If it's more productive, it's less valuable. If it's less productive, it's more valuable per commodity. This is determined by a wide range of circumstances. It is determined, amongst other things, by the worker's average degree of skill, the level of development of science and its technological application, the social organization of the process of production, the extent and effectiveness of the means of production, and the conditions found in the natural environment. Okay, so more skilled workers means, on average, can mean more productivity. Science and technology can mean more productivity. Organizing the workplace more efficiently can mean more productivity. Extent and effectiveness of the means of production is like, yeah, you're actually literal, like industry, its effectiveness. And then nature, things like the weather. For example, the same quantity of labor is present in 8 bushels of corn in favorable seasons and only 4 bushels in the unfavorable seasons, right? So presumably, if it's a favorable season, an hour of labor, you make more corn. You get more bushels of corn than in an unfavorable season, right? So during the unfavorable season, the price of corn goes doubles. The same quantity of labor provides more metal in rich mines than poor, right? So if it's a poor mine, if it doesn't have a lot of minerals there, you're going to spend more work to harvest things. Diamonds are of very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs on average a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small volume. Jacob questions whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. And then there's some statistics here. According to Esquivega, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 still did not amount to the price of 1.5 years average produce of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds represented much more labor and therefore more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would be embodied in more diamonds and their value would fall. If a man succeeds without much labor in transforming carbon into diamonds, the value might fall below that of bricks. So why are diamonds so expensive? Because they are rare. And so you have to spend more time in the mines looking for the diamonds before you find them. Meaning that when you find a diamond, all the time you spent looking for it is reflected in the value of that diamond. Yet we have developed ways to make artificial diamonds. And guess what happened to the value of diamonds? It plummeted. Because it became easier to make diamonds. You don't have to spend all day digging for them. In general, the greater productivity of labor, the less the labor time required to produce that article, the less the mass of labor crystallized in that article, the less its value. Right? So if we're more productive, being more productive, more commodities per hour, or needing less time to make commodities, cheaper. Inversely, the less the productivity of labor, the greater the labor time necessary to produce a commodity or an article, the greater its value. The harder it is to make something, the more valuable it is. The longer it takes, the more valuable it is. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely the productivity of the labor which finds its realization within the commodity. right? So how productive is the labor? How much labor, how productive is the labor? Those are the factors that determine the price. Now we have this is was deleted in the later editions, but it's in the first edition of Capital. Now we know the substance of value, it is labor. We know the measure of its magnitude, it is labor time. The form which stamps value as exchange value remains to be analyzed. But before this, we needed to fully to develop the characteristics we have already found somewhat more fully. So we're going to get to exchange value and things like this. I think it was deleted because he goes on to talk about in the next section that we'll read next Tuesday about the labor, the abstract and concrete labor. A thing can be a use value without being a value. This is the case whenever its utility demand is not mediated through labor. Air, virgin soil, natural meadows, unplanted forests, etc., fall into this category. All right, so air is valuable, has a use value. We breathe it, but you can't buy air unless it's like in a can, right? And you like spray on your computer or whatever. But then labor is put it into that can, right? So you're actually buying the labor. A thing can be useful and a product of human labor without being a commodity. He who satisfies his own need with the product of his own labor admittedly creates use values, but not commodities, right? If I go make myself a sandwich in the kitchen, I've made a use value, but I haven't made a commodity because I'm not selling the sandwich. I'm not trading the sandwich. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. All right, so I have to make a use value, and it has to be traded or exchanged somehow with someone else. Yet, we should be cautious here because there's this whole discussion of social reproduction too. And there is a sense at a higher level of analysis, when we get to how capitalism reproduces the conditions for the continuation of capitalism, that domestic labor is caught up in this whole system of value, and there is unequal domestic labor and unpaid forms of domestic labor that could be analyzed from the perspective of value as well. But then Engels adds this little note here where he says, and not merely for others, the medieval peasant produced corn rent for the feudal lord and corn tithe for priests, but neither the corn rent nor the corn tithe became commodity simply by being produced for others. In order to become a commodity, the product must be transferred to the other person for whom it serves as a use value through the medium of exchange. Yeah, I wonder too, like at the same time, it seems like we can measure the value of these things using the value form. Right? Like you can say like, well, this is how much that corn, how much of that labor time is expressed in the corn that's appropriated by the landlord or the feudal lord. Finally, nothing can be of value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. So labor can only create value if it creates something useful. Like if I dig a hole and then fill the hole back up, I can't really how much am I getting paid for, what, you didn't do anything useful. The labor has to be labor that someone finds a use in. Marx already said that the use values have to be actualized through consumption. All right, so the railroad tracks that we, that trains can't run on because they're too old and broken or whatever are useless. They don't have a use value anymore. Maybe you can find a use value in them somehow, but they don't have the use value that they were designed for, at least. But useless labor doesn't create value. It has to be something that is useful. And now, useful in the sense that it satisfies a human need arising from the imagination or stomach, right? So you might say a barista putting a flower in a latte is not useful labor, but it is useful labor because it satisfies something in the imagination. Like someone's you're adding something to the value of the commodity, the value of the experience, which corresponds to something that is appeals to the imagination. Right, and that takes effort and takes practice, and you have to learn how to do it, a certain amount of skill and all of that. that's the end of this section. Sorry about all the problems with having it re-recorded and things like this. How did I go all the way to the beginning again? I apologize. So I'm going to do a little review. We talked about this first sentence a lot, where wealth is appearing in the form of commodities. And we talked a little bit about why that is. It's because things enter into exchange, and exchange abstracts from this use value and abstracts from the particular type of labor and involves human labor in the abstract as the social abstract form of socially necessary labor time. We talked about what the commodity is. First of all, it's a thing. It's an external object. It satisfies a human need, whether arising from the imagination or stomach. Somebody wants that commodity. It can be viewed from quality and quantity. It's a thing with properties, and these properties satisfy a human need. The usefulness of the thing is based on the material properties of the commodity. We can discover scientifically what can this commodity do. That's what it's useful for. And that's a physical feature of the commodity. It's not something that dangles in midair. But it also is a relationship between these properties and human desires and human needs. Use values are only realized in consumption, right? They have to be consumable to be realized. This can be through using them as a means of production or directly satisfying the consumer. Exchange value is the other feature of commodities belonging to this form of society. Use value is independent of society, right? It doesn't depend on the social form. It's the material content of wealth. But exchange value is the way things all appear under capitalism in the form of society considered here. Exchange value is a quantitative relation. It's a proportion. We say this thing is worth a certain amount of this other thing. When we examine more closely, however, there's a content. If this thing is worth a certain amount of this thing, and also this thing, and also this thing, and also this thing, then they all have some kind of proportion to each other, and they are all equal in some way. And that equality must be because they contain a certain amount of something. And what is it? It's not anything physical. It's not anything material. It's that they are all products of human labor, and not just a specific type of human labor, but human labor in the abstract. Finally, the phantom-like objectivity. And then we talked about exchange value as the form of appearance of commodities, or a value. So value, socially necessary labor time. How long does it take the average worker using the technology available to make that thing? That's what's being traded. And when something appears in the form of something else, one form of value, one socially necessary labor time embodied in commodity, is expressing itself in terms of another commodity, a certain amount of another commodity, because that commodity takes an equal amount of socially necessary labor time to make. You can't just be lazy, right? And just like work, for forever to make your thing more valuable, because it depends on what is actually on average required to make something. And then we talked about the ways that this works with like diamonds, right? Where the diamonds are very rare, so it takes a lot of time to find them. So the one diamond is worth a ton of has a ton of labor time put into it. And then we talked about the exceptions, how things can be use values without being values, and how not everything's a commodity. So that is section 1 of Capital. We're going to get into the dual character of labor embodied in the commodities, this whole abstract versus concrete side of labor. Now, again, I apologize for having to do the stream twice. I'm still learning about how to do all of this stuff. I'm going to do a Patreon response to each of these, where I kind of go back over and give a kind of summary, go over some things that maybe weren't as clear in the presentation at some point. So stay tuned for that. be sure to like and subscribe and all that jazz. And thank you, everybody who listened to this. And we'll be back Tuesday at 7 this time, because I'm going to actually make sure my microphone's on. I think I just had it muted on the computer. But I will see you then. Until next time. Bye-bye.